All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So we're at part 4 of this series on myth and mind, and the story that we're exploring today, the story of Psyche, is one of my favorite stories. It's loaded with meanings and symbols in literally each and every part of the story that there is really deep meaning. And in that sense, we can talk about the story of Psyche for a week. So this is going to be a really condensed version of taking parts of that story and looking at what we can learn for us here and now. So far in this series, we've been looking at mythology through various lenses. In the first part of the series, we spoke about the septenary framework and how we as human beings have 7 layers of consciousness in us, and how are we evolving through those layers of consciousness individually and collectively. And then in the last 2 talks, we explored the story of Arjuna, specifically in terms of Arjuna on the battlefield and that conversation with Krishna. So we spoke about that specific part of the myth. And the last time we spoke about Prometheus, who brought down the fire from the gods, which is in a sense about a person who brings down consciousness into society in any given sense of the term. What happens to a person like that? If you look at the term myth, it derives from the Greek word muthos, and muthos is spoken truth. It is truth, that is truths about life and the universe that's passed on through the oral traditions. Over terms, as the term muthos and therefore mythology got adapted into various other languages and other disciplines, the meaning of it has somewhat shifted for us. So when we perceive the word mythology, sometimes it's perceived as something that is untrue, which is quite the opposite of what it was meant to be. Modern day mythology, of course, is also very politicized, and there's religion brought into the mix and all of that. But if we have to go back to the root of the word, spoken truth, that's the underlying theme throughout this series, that we're looking at what are the spoken truths that have been handed down to us through various cultures around the world, and what do they mean for us today. So today's story we will look at the story through this particular lens, like the septenary framework that we spoke about in the first talk. This is another framework which Plato had proposed, so it's a Greek framework that we're using today. So Plato's proposition with the trichotomy, you'll find several trichotomies in philosophy, several for lack of a better word, groups of 3 things. And groups of 3 coming down from the Holy Trinity to various other philosophical groups of 3 which look at evolution in various lenses. Plato speaks of the trichotomy in terms of saying that a human being has 3 layers to self, and the whole idea of living life and experiencing life the way we do is to go through these 3 layers in order to be able to find oneself and therefore find God. God not in a religious sense, but God in the highest consciousness sense of the term. So the bottom layer that you see there is the soma, the body, which is our first layer of experience. The moment we are born, we are extremely conscious of the body and its needs and its desires. And the soma is linked to the mind, which is the psyche. The Greeks, of course, define psyche as soul, so there is a slightly different take on that. But broadly, when we talk of philosophy or psychology, the term psyche is interpreted as mind. Mind not in the brain sense of the term, it's not just thoughts, but the higher mind. And the psyche aspires, just as the soma looks up to the psyche aspires towards what is termed as the nous. The nous is we can very loosely call it soul, but what we mean is something tending towards divinity, our highest consciousness at a collective sense, not so much the personal but the collective soul. And the general experience of humankind has been that this, if you have to look at this particular piece, the psyche tends to look down, it's like the mirror looking down, to focus on the needs of the soma, to focus on the needs of the body. Right? And therefore in the physical world that we live in, entropy is a very natural thing to happen, that if we, that there is a lot of focus downward, and we experience it in a physical sense through gravity, we experience it in a social sense through focus on physical and material needs and so on. And the aspiration of the spiritual journey is to flip the psyche up and move towards the nous, to move away from the soma, which is not to deny the soma, not to deny the body, but to be able to work with it and overcome base needs to look at higher needs and point the psyche towards the nous. So in a way, moving from unconscious to the conscious self is at the center of this framework. So now the Greeks took up this psyche and embodied psyche as a personality in the myth of Psyche. So in the myth, in the story, Psyche is this beautiful princess of a Greek monarch, and like a lot of stories go, this princess is a young woman and she's waiting for a Prince Charming to come along. And while there are many elements of the story, I'm going to skip a lot of it. It comes to a point where they wait for a really long time. There is Psyche and there are her two sisters, and Psyche eventually does not find anybody who's a worthy suitor. And the king gets extremely worried and he does not know what to do, so he goes to an oracle in Delphi, and the oracle tells him that the only way Psyche can find a partner is if you're willing to let her go, and the process of letting her go has to be that she has to be dressed as if she is on the way to her own funeral, which means she can't be robed as a princess, she has to be in her death robes, and you have to carry her up to the top of a hill, leave her there, and you have to come back never turning back. And the king agonizes over this decision, and he, as a father, obviously he does not feel good about it, but eventually he gives in and they decide to dress up Psyche as if she's dead. They carry her funeral procession up on the hill, and she's left up there, and the rest of the kingdom comes back in mourning. And true enough, just as the oracle says, at the top of the hill where Psyche is all alone, she finds love. The god of love, Cupid, comes around and they fall in love. Now the god of love, Cupid, has been sent there with a specific purpose. Cupid's mother was Venus. Venus is the goddess of justice, beauty, compassion. She's represented in many forms. And Venus had apparently through all of these years tried to ensure through Cupid that Psyche never falls in love. Right? And it's attributed to jealousy, which of course is not so much a personal characteristic as much as a literary device so that the story moves along. And so that was Venus's intention. However, that falls on his head because Cupid falls in love with Psyche, and the condition is, as Cupid falls in love with Psyche, Psyche has never seen Cupid. She has experienced him around as she's up there on the hill all alone. And when they come together, Cupid's condition is that we will meet only in the dark. He builds this beautiful palace for her. She's comfortable up there all alone. And the condition is that he will come every night to visit her and that she can never ask to see him. And for a long time, she lives like that, and they're both very happy about it. Till one day, Psyche decides to come down from the hill down to the kingdom and visit her father's house. Cupid warns her against it. He says that for them you're dead, so don't go back, but she does not listen, and one day she happens to go and visit her father's house. And there, of course, the entire kingdom is thrilled to have Psyche back, and they celebrate. And while she is resting in the palace and chatting with her sisters, her sister asks her about her life, and she tells them about Cupid. And they ask her the obvious questions: what is he like? What does he look like? What does he do? And she has no answers because she's never seen the person. He only visits her in the dark, so she does not know too much about him except for the fact that he's been a very loving person. And these two sisters don't really like this fact, and they scold her and they ask her, how can you do something like this? How can you be with a partner that you don't even know who the partner is? You've never seen the person. You've no idea. For all you know, it could be a monster. Right? So it's not really wise of you to be staying with this person. So you have to figure out a way to at least see what he's like, to look at him. And they sow these doubts in Psyche's mind. Eventually, of course, she comes back to her own palace on the hill. And that night, after Cupid goes to sleep, Psyche lights a candle to see his face. And in that moment, Cupid wakes up, and his statement is, where there is no trust, there can't be love. And he goes away, and he leaves her. And Psyche, of course, is devastated, and she does not know what to do next. She agonizes for a long, long time, and finally goes to the temple of Venus, to her mother-in-law, to ask her where Cupid is and where can she find him. And Venus being Venus, and again a literary device, she says, I will lead you to my son, provided you fulfill 4 tasks. I cannot lead you to him directly. And therefore Psyche is given these 4 tasks, and each of them come with a very tight deadline and a lot of regulations. And Venus's condition is that if you manage to complete all of those 4 tasks, then I will allow you to meet Cupid. So you have these 4 tasks. The first task is where she is given a pile of seeds. Now there are some versions of the story which talk of it as grains, some of them refer to it as seeds. So there are these 7 different types of seeds or grains that are given to her, and it's a whole huge heap. And her task is that by the time it's daylight, she has to have it sorted in separate heaps. Task 2 is there are these sheep with a golden fleece, and she's asked to retrieve some of the wool from the fleece from the sheep. Task 3 is she's asked to fill an urn, a jug of water from the source of the river Styx. The river Styx in Greek mythology is pretty much like the river Vaitarni in Indian mythology, where it is where you cross from the land of the living to the land of the dead. That's the river Styx. And the 4th task is to return from the underworld with again different versions of the story. Some versions talk of it as return with the elixir of life. Some versions talk of it as the elixir of beauty, which is the ointment of Persephone, which again refers to another Greek myth. So there are these 4 tasks, and of course the condition is that she can't go to task 2 without finishing task 1. So all of them have to be done in a certain order. So the first task, so Psyche is in this room full of mixed up seeds, and she starts the task, and she knows there's very limited time, and at some point in time she realizes it's impossible. There's this huge pile and she can barely scratch the surface of it. And at some point she breaks down. She doesn't know how she would ever manage to complete a task like this, because imagine, even if you had a small pile of grains that are mixed up, to be able to pick out each grain is extremely tedious. And she breaks down till a point in time she finds a few ants coming her way, and the ants ask her what's happening, and she tells them about her story. And the ants go about organizing their entire colony of ants. They all of them come along, and sure enough, by the time it's sunrise, the heaps are nicely distributed. Right? Now, if you have to look at the symbolism of it, right, the idea of ants are these tiny creatures who are extremely resilient, who can carry up to they are able to carry about 50 times their own body weight in terms of things that they are able to carry. If you look at ants anywhere around the world, you will find this utter sense of discipline. There's no wayward ant who's doing its own thing. They're always in a line. They make sure that any person in their colony, any ant in the colony who's trapped, they will all go back and try and retrieve that person and bring him or her back. Extremely disciplined, extremely committed to the collective good. It's not so much about the individual ego. Everyone works towards a collective goal in an ant colony. So if you look at the first task of Psyche, it is about organizing her will, organizing her sense of priorities, about what is more important to me. If you look at her experience, she was extremely happy with Cupid, and yet there was this desire to say, let me go back to my father now that I'm alive and well, let me go back to the father's house and visit them. And in the process allows her sisters, so if you look at the idea of two sisters, the symbolism of the two sisters is the symbolism of what is called the Kama Manas in the septenary, which is the doubting mind. The mind that casts aspersions, the mind that causes suspicion and lack of trust. Right? And she allows herself to be seeded with that lack of trust because she hasn't had her priorities clear. She still does not know that she utterly and completely trusts her partner, and in the process makes herself light that candle. The lighting the candle is about trying to give the formless a form, right? Give love, which is a vast concept, right? It's not even a person, it's an idea, and she tries to give it a form by trying to see it. Much like the idea of idol worship, where the formless is tried to be brought down to a form and named and defined, and in the process priorities are lost. She loses trust of her partner. She's anyway in that sense dead to her family members, yet she tries to go back to them. So there is a whole lot of misplaced sense of organization about what is her center. So sometimes she's allied to the partner, sometimes she's trying to be allied to her sisters, to her father, to herself, and therefore there is really no sense of what her center is. And the whole idea of the first task is to be able to organize, to find out what is my center, what is my priority. If I'm able to make sure that my evolution, my growth is at the center, then everything else serves it. The relationship serves it, work serves it, all of it serves it. So if you have to look at a very practical learning from here, it's about looking at what is at the center of our lives. And sometimes we mix up between goals and means to the goals. A lot of times we put the means at the center and then everything else works around it, and in the process, if the means is shaken, the entire life is shaken. For example, if let's say if I put my career or work at the center of my life, and for some reason I lose my job, everything around it is shaken, because it's just a means to a goal. My work is a means of, again, personal growth, spiritual growth, and it serves that growth. But if I put it at the center, then it's not organizing my priorities well. So that's the first task, where she's asked to center herself, to call on the discipline of the ants, the will, the resilience, the sense of commitment to task, regardless of personal ego. And that's what ants represent. There's no personal ego there. It is about the collective. And of course, there are a lot of deeper layers if we delve into the story, but we've got 4 tasks to look at. So that's the first task, and she manages to complete it with the help of the ants, and therefore the next morning Venus gives her the second task. The second task is that she needs to retrieve the golden fleece from a flock of sheep, which are known for this beautiful golden fleece, and they're known to be very rare. And Psyche thinks, okay, seems like a simple enough task, it's just sheep, they should be okay. But when she actually goes to the place where they're grazing, she realizes these are not meek, mild sheep, they're carnivorous and they're wild, and there's no way she can approach them directly, let alone try and cut off some fleece from them. And again, she breaks down, she doesn't know what to do, and she's sobbing by the side of a river. And the reeds that grow by the side of the river, those plants like papyrus, the reeds by the river start speaking to her. And they ask her, well, what's happening? And she tells them her story again. And the reeds tell her that, yes, the sheep are indeed wild. There's no way you can personally approach them. However, just before sunset, all of them come to have a drink of water before they go back. And when they come to have a drink of water, invariably, because there are a lot of reeds by the bank of the river, some of the fur usually gets stuck to the reed, and she can pluck those later once they go and hand that to Venus, and thus the task can be completed. And sure enough, she does that and completes the task. Again, a beautiful task representative of testing how I respond to the world. If I have completed the first task, if I have my priorities right, if I know what my center is, how do I respond to the world? There is, if we have to use an Indian form of interpretation, there is the tamasic response, which Psyche went into. The tamasic response is the response of inactivity, of lethargy, lack of movement, right? And there is the rajasic response, which is reactivity, which is to say, let me go out, get a dagger, kill the sheep and retrieve the wool, right? And there are these 2 forces that we tend to keep pulled by, the force of inactivity and the force of reactivity. And what the reeds teach Psyche is, can you be sattvic? Can you make the right movement at the right time, in the right measure? You don't have to go kill the sheep, and you don't have to completely give up and sit and cry. There doesn't have to be absolute reactivity or absolute inactivity. Wait for the right moment, the right times, look for the opportunity, and if you're able to look for the opportunity, you will find that the retrieving the fleece is possible, and it does not cause anybody any harm. So to be able to come to that state of sattva, to be able to come to that state of conscious action, where I know when to wait, when to act, without being inactive or reactive, right? So how do I learn to respond to the world in a very conscious manner, in the right moment, the right measure, the right action? And so the task gets completed, and Venus gets her fleece. And the third task is to fill an urn with water from the source of the river Styx. Now, the river Styx, as we said, is where you cross from the land of the living to the land of the dead, which means Psyche cannot touch the water, because if she touches, then the life is over. Right? And therefore she has to figure out a way to collect the water from the source without actually getting into the water. And again, she goes into despair. She figures the source of the Styx. Again, when we talk of the source, it's about my source, my will, right? And how do I touch that source while still being embodied? How do I touch God while still being embodied without having to give up my life and my incarnation for it? And as she despairs and she's waiting with her urn, an eagle comes by. And eagle in the Greek myth is, again, you will see eagle also in the myth of Prometheus, where the eagle comes and pecks at his liver all the time. Eagle is the symbol of the god Zeus. In Indian mythology, eagle is the symbol, the Garuda is the symbol of Vishnu. In each of these mythologies, the eagle represents will and wisdom. It flies really close to the sun. Sun is the source of our life, and sun is the center of our being. And similarly, when you talk of the source of the river Styx, it's about source of our willpower, our sense, our soul. And the eagle comes, picks up the urn, gets the water, and she does not have to step in, but the task gets completed, right? So when she summons her will, then through the sheer power of the will, one is able to attain consciousness, one is able to touch God without having to die in the process, without having to step into the river Styx. And so the third task gets completed with the power of the eagle. Now if you look at each of these symbolisms here, the ant, the reeds, the eagle, each of them are representative of an aspect of our personality that we are asked to call upon in the journey of evolution. From the movement from Soma to Psyche to Nous is representative of each of these forms. And so the final task that Venus gives her is to cross over the river and obtain the elixir of life, or the ointment of Persephone, depending on which version of the story you read, from the underworld. Right? Now to get into the underworld, she has to cross the Styx without touching the water. And while she tries to figure out how this needs to be done, a boatman comes to her rescue. Now the symbolism of the boatman, again in various myths around the world, is about someone who leads one from one world to another, one dimension into another. Like the idea of the shaman is very much the idea of a boatman. Right? So the boatman helps to lead her from one bank to the other, where she can go into the underworld. And he warns her that the guardian of the underworld is a four-headed dog, and he is not going to let you go past the door. So you need to figure out how to do this. And so Psyche sits and thinks about what can she do, and she's got a piece of bread on her, and the boatman says, okay, this dog has 4 mouths, it's a 4-faced dog. Tear your bread into 4 pieces, throw them in different directions so that the dog is confused and distracted because it doesn't know which mouth wants to pick up the bread. And in the confusion, the door will be unattended and you can slip down into the underworld. And she deploys that technique, throws the bread around, and the dog is confused, and she goes in and sure enough gets the elixir. And when she gets the elixir, her task is to simply give the elixir back to Venus. She's tempted and has a little of it herself, and goes into a state of dreamless sleep. Now, if you look back at the symbolism here, it's the 4-headed dog, again, distractions which come on the spiritual path, and to look at how do I make sure that I get over the distractions, how do I feed it in a manner that my path is clear, right? And so, which is in a way the deployment of intelligence. Intelligence not in the IQ or intellect, not in the Kamamanisic sense of the term, but higher intelligence. And how do you utilize intelligence in a manner that you keep walking towards your center, walking towards your path, regardless of other distractions. That will always call for our attention. And the distractions happen to come in the form of this loyal dog who's apparently trying to guard our safety. It's like, sometimes there are, when you're walking on your path and there are people saying, oh no, but this is the age to pay attention to your family. Oh no, you have to be practical and earn an income. Oh no, you have to do this. All of which is very loyal behavior, and at the same time it can be distracting on our path. And therefore, how do we throw around that bread so that the detractors are fed while our path is clear? And of course she goes into this state of sleep because she consumes the elixir. But at this point, grace starts flowing. Cupid starts looking for her because he knows she's out on these tasks, and his mother has sent her out somewhere. And Cupid, with the help of Jupiter, revives Psyche, and then they live happily ever after. Now, if you look at the beginning and the end of the story, yeah, she was with Cupid before, she is with Cupid after. Nothing much has changed. What has changed is that entire journey. She was with Cupid earlier in a very unconscious manner, without having made an effort for it, without having really seen the truth of what she is in. And at the end of that journey, she's immortal. She's consumed that elixir. So there is the journey from mortality to immortality, from human to God, from soma to nous. How Psyche moves from being in the soma, in the body, to being divine, to actually touch her own nous, to be able to conquer her own lower self. So yeah, so they unite at the end of the story. So if you look at there are several layers of the story, and I find it extremely helpful to keep delving into each of those tasks one by one, sometimes to look at how am I doing on those tasks in my life, in terms of, is my center clear, for example, right? I mean, is my life organized well, like those 7 types of seeds, right? Do I look at the spiritual journey not at the cost of the physical, right? Well, one doesn't have to touch the water in order to be able to attain, evolve consciously. So each of those symbolisms has huge and deep meaning if we have to look at reflecting and contemplating on each of these things. So some reflections that I'd leave you with are, one is, and there are several of these, but just a few here. How do I educate my personality? And when I say education, not in the academic sense of the term, but educate in terms of being able to discipline the soma, to discipline the body in a way that it does not come in the way of whatever is my priority, whatever is at my center. So that evolution of consciousness is at the center, everything else is in service of it. So physical needs are in service of it, work is in service of it, all of it points at the center. What is it that I sacrifice? And of course the term sacrifice is sometimes used in a very different way now. I don't necessarily mean giving up, but how do I make something sacred? Right? How do I make a practice sacred enough to be able to access a higher level of consciousness? So for example, if I'm talking about not having a certain kind of food, one way of saying sacrifice is to say give up, so I've given up sugar so that I'm healthy. But the other is to say, how do I make the practice of eating healthy so that I'm respectful of my body? So how do I sacrifice in that sense so that the path remains clear? And of course the idea of conscious action, the choosing of sattva between rajasic and tamasic forces, between the temptations of inactivity and reactivity. How do I choose action in the right moment, in the right time, at the right opportunity? So those are a very few of the many, many reflections that the myth of Psyche has, but I'll hold that here for today. Any questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.